you might remember the 4 different catastrophic explosions last September, that blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. The attack on the huge underwater pipes in the Baltic Sea that supply Russian gas to Germany sparked an international whodunnit. But what is less known is also triggered an extraordinary new undersea arms race as nervous European countries rush to protect their critical infrastructure. That's the revelation in a new report tonight, because the attack revealed it to be extremely vulnerable, and it's not just energy supplies either. 99% of the world's communications are also delivered by almost 1 million miles of underwater cables, and if they're destroyed, the consequences could be disastrous for everything from the international banking system to NHS services. Another example of the threat came just yesterday when an investigation by Scandinavian TV channels exposed Russian spy ships charting British wind turbines in the North Sea. Well, the author of tonight's new report is the journalist and broadcaster Willem Marks, who joins me now, as does the military analyst down the line, Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Willem and Sean, good to see you both. Willem, let's come to you first, because you've just finished this long investigation. What did you discover about who was responsible for blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines?
Headline, Tom, I didn't find out who did this. And people have been trying for months, governments, police, prosecutors. There's been a bit of information dripping out about the identities of those that may have been involved. But what was really interesting, talking to Danish officials, for instance, and I talked to dozens of people in half a dozen countries, Danish officials are talking about the timing, the location of these blasts. They were in what's known as exclusive economic zones belonging to Denmark and Sweden, but not in their territorial waters. That would have constituted an attack on a NATO member and a future NATO member and would have had consequences for whoever was responsible. What we've seen, though, is this blame game with the leaders of some European countries initially saying, maybe Russia's involved. The Kremlin saying, Britain's responsible. The UK saying, that's ridiculous. More recently, German officials saying, it may not be Russia after all. I've got people on the record, including former senior officials from the Central Intelligence Agency, saying they would, quote, bet a mortgage payment on it being Ukrainians, not necessarily at the direction of Kiev, perhaps working unilaterally. That's something that we've now seen reported in other US and German media as well.
What's so fascinating is no one has been publicly fingered for it yet. Why not?
Because seemingly, and the former head of Estonian intelligence, for instance, told me, if it wasn't the Russians and people found out it wasn't the Russians, what's the upside of fingering someone else if it is, for instance, the Ukrainians? Because there's a huge amount of geopolitical tension there. Yeah. This is something that people like Germany would take very badly.
All right. All this, of course, has triggered this extraordinary battle for supremacy under the seas, if you like. How is that playing out?
Well, here in the UK, for instance, we spent 70 million a few months ago buying a ship that's being retrofitted that will focus on protecting critical undersea infrastructure. They've got another ship they're planning through right now to contract to build. In France, they've developed a new undersea policy that's going to be focused on drones and robots. In Denmark, they're really worried. They got rid of their sub program 20 years ago. What are they going to do now? They're going to invest possibly in more sonar equipment. That's at the centre of defence spending conversations in Danish politics, in Sweden, about to join NATO. They're really re-energised, the Navy officials there I talked to, about the fact they're going to have this important role in NATO because they've got a great sub-programme, because they know how to operate in complicated parts of the world like the Baltic. And that is, in terms of ocean going, a very complicated part of the world.
Certainly is. Willem, we'll come back to you in a sec. But Sean, let me come to you now. Let's just look at how vulnerable we are to underwater sabotage. And we've got a bit of a graphic to show you, and it's where all Britain's underwater infrastructure is. It's quite extraordinary. We were going through this earlier. We couldn't really believe it. Our cables first, because there are almost 60 of them in total. They carry internet and telephone communications plus power, and they connect us up to the rest of the world, as far away as America and as close as Ireland. And on top of all that, this is our network of oil and gas pipelines. The most important, perhaps, being the pipeline that carries a huge amount of natural gas from Norway, and we're in big need of that at the moment. So, Sean, kind of obvious question, how on earth do you protect hundreds of thousands of miles of these cables and pipes, some of them 2 miles under the sea?
The short answer is with great difficulty. I think it's worth reflecting that part of the reason we're even talking about this is because of the Nordic broadcaster, look into this, and the spy ship, and he was looking at the cables. First of all, those ships, I've got grey hair from several decades of serving in the military, and when I first joined, it was formerly the Russians, and then formerly the Soviet Union, and lastly the Russians, who always had ships that were spying, and they used to call them trawlers, but they didn't have any nets on, and they weren't catching any fish. So this is nothing new. I think what has changed is that back in those days we didn't have the undersea infrastructure that we clearly do today. And one of the challenges, as you quite rightly say, the North Sea is relatively shallow, so it's not difficult to identify where this stuff is, but it does give us relative element of redundancy. As soon as you get into the North Atlantic, where, okay, it is very deep, but we now have some very critical infrastructure. And it's not just there, it's also in space. I mean, a rocket sent into space and blowing up sand in space would take out all of our satellite communications. There is increasing vulnerability. Now, there are ways in which the military are able to protect some of the undersea cables, and obviously that strays into all sorts of wacky security environments. But I would also come back to your guest about apparently what's also emerged in Norway apparently had an undersea data cable that was severed at the end of last year. They weren't quite sure how that happened, but it sort of alluded to the fact that it probably was an act of sabotage. And also the Danish Defence Patrol had, was it 112 pictures, I think, of Russian craft that were all around that Nord Stream site just 4 days before the explosion, and some of those Russian craft had cranes on, submersibles, the like. Now, I'm not an investigator and I'm certainly not a maritime expert, but I don't think the Ukrainians have that sort of military capability, and the Russians certainly do. And there seems to me a much greater intent there. Now, clearly, it's for the experts to decide what actually happened, but I have to say, from all of the briefings I get, I find it very hard to imagine that the Ukrainians would actually be responsible for that pipeline being blown.
Okay, I guess you two could probably have this debate for quite some time. Probably what you could both agree on, though, both Sean and Willem, Sean, to you first, is that what has changed here is the will to attack all these things. That didn't exist before.
No, it didn't. But I think we're also in an interdependent world. You also got to look at who benefits from some of these things happening. I mean, let's be clear at the moment. The reason we're focusing on Russia is because it's trapped in a war of attrition with Ukraine. It's not going well. And now we've even had NATO Secretary General go out there and announce his, support for Ukraine. And Russia is having to look very carefully at where it turns next. But it's pretty clear at the moment that Russia wouldn't want to pick a fight with the rest of the world. Its already beleaguered army has struggled, and therefore, why would it do that? I think much more interestingly is what China is learning from this war in Ukraine, and if it was to take on Taiwan, if its military adventurism was to extend that far, I think it's inevitable that we have to look to where our vulnerabilities are. And undoubtedly, the data cables, the energy pipelines are all really part of that in a way that they were never so critical in the past.
All right, Willem, here's the other point. You can do this. You can blow up Nord Stream pipelines full of Russian oil and gas, and you can get away with it. That's going to encourage more people, isn't it?
Well, certainly that's been one of the challenges for officials looking into this, is trying to understand why exactly this has happened, how easy it's been for these people to do it, and if there aren't consequences, what does that mean in the future?
Fascinating stuff. Willem and Sean, thank you so much, both for you, for joining me tonight. A final footnote to this story before we move on. The undersea cable's vulnerability was first publicly flagged back in 2017 by one new up-and-coming Tory MP. His name? Rishi Sunak, and he wrote a report calling them indispensable and insecure. I wonder whatever came of him.